There we go. And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for tonight. We have a wonderful, wonderful presentation by Brenda Ramirez tonight. But before we get there, if you are currently a member of Los Angeles Birders, I want to thank you. Thank you very much for supporting us, going on our trips, adding to our knowledge, and just the moral support that LA Birders needs. We really appreciate it. If you're not a member, I'd like to encourage you to become a member. It's only $20 a year. We have a lifetime membership benefit also. Just about all of we have our webinars, and your dues help support these webinars and keep them available for everyone to use off our YouTube channel, or go to our website to link to our YouTube channel and see these wonderful webinars. But we also offer many opportunities for trips and things that usually are only open to lab members, such as the one coming up in which we'll be touring more labs at the end of this month, or end of next month. And our field trips are usually our members only because they usually fill up by members. So please join Lab and help support this wonderful organization. And with that, I would like to introduce Molly, who is a Lab S member, and she will introduce our speaker for tonight. Molly?
Hi, thanks, Ron. It is our pleasure to introduce Brenda Ramirez, a research technician with the free-flying Los Angeles Parrot project at the Moore Lab of Zoology at Occidental College. Brenda holds both a BS and an MS from California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, where she developed expertise in working with large community science datasets and integrating them into spatial models to analyze species distributions over millennia. Brenda's journey into the world of urban parrots began during a walk with her mother at the Huntington Botanical Gardens, where she first encountered the vibrant and chaotic presence of free-flying parrots. This moment sparked her lifelong fascination with how tropical species have adapted to life in Los Angeles, one of the world's largest urban landscapes. Today, Brenda leads a team investigating the remarkable story of how red-crowned and lilac-crowned parrots, originally from Mexico, have established breeding populations in our cities, even as these same species face the threat of extinction in their native habitat. Her research focuses on understanding the genetic changes in these parrots as they adapt to urban environments. Please join me in welcoming Brenda Ramirez.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Super excited to chat with you all. So let me pull up my presentation.
Great.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, that looks wonderful. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So once again, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to chat with all of you about the parrots of Southern California, which are, of course, our favorite chatty neighbors. And so to begin, I wanted to give a little bit of background on the Moore Lab for those of you that may not be familiar with it, but it was established in 1951 by Robert T. Moore when he donated his personal collection to Occidental College. Here, we're the home to around 2,200 bird species and around 65,000 individuals. This collection is made up of eggs, nests, birds, even skeletons. And so on the right, you can see a photo of some of the eggs in our collection. And then on the bottom right, you can see some specimen that have museum tags. And so these museum tags are extremely important because they have information on when the bird was collected, where, and so all of these things go into our research that is both done by staff like myself, but also undergraduate students that have these research projects that allow them to gain these incredible skills and just build on their ability to analyze data and work with these incredible specimens that we have in our collection. Something really special about our collection is that We actually have the world's largest collection of Mexican endemic birds with around 50,000. And so being able to work in a museum collection is extremely important because it gives us a window into what these species were like at different time points. And so we can look at them genetically, morphologically, and so it's a really amazing opportunity to be able to study these species. So as mentioned, I work at Oxy doing the Free Flying Los Angeles Parrot Project, or FLAPP, because we couldn't pass up an opportunity for a pun. And so we are actually collaborating with the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum, as well as a parrot rescue called SoCal Parrot. And so the main objectives of our program and our project is to really understand the different ecological and genomic changes that parrots that have been introduced into Southern California have experienced. We also really want to understand how Southern California is different to their native ranges, or if it's similar. These parrots have been brought here, and now, as we all know, they're found in huge numbers. And so we really want to understand what has allowed this to happen. So that brings me to one of my favorite topics when I do talks like this, which is, how did the parrots get here? I feel like I always hear these incredible stories that people just know is true. They're certain this is how it happened. And so depending on where you are within Southern California, one of the more popular stories that I hear is the pet shop fire. So in 1959, Simpson's garden town caught on fire, and the owner very heroically ran inside, release the animals, including parrots, so that they would survive. And so many people believe this is 100% the origin of the parrots. This is how they were brought here. And so recently I did a talk, and the insurance adjuster for this incident confirmed the story. He said that the fire did happen and that the owner did release some animals, including parrots. And so a lot of people do believe that story to be the origin. And then another very popular story is that when Busch Gardens was closing in Sylmar, I believe, allegedly one of the nets in the aviary fell and it released parrots into the wild. And so, although we don't know if these events actually happened, well, the Simpsons fire did happen. We don't know if it's the origin of the parrots. What we do know is that the biggest reason that they're here is the illegal pet trade. And so parrots and many other animals get smuggled, and then tried to be sold as pets. And so a lot of the time they will escape, or people don't realize that it's a huge commitment and they'll release their pets, or they get released accidentally. And so over time, these parrots have been introduced into Southern California. And so that really makes me wonder, how many parrot species is there actually in Southern California? People aren't just buying one type of parrot, there's a huge range. And so within iNaturalist, the Free Flying Los Angeles Parrot Project collects observations of all of these parrots. And so the ones that are the most observed and uploaded into FLAPP are these. So the red-crowned parrot has almost 3,000 observations. Then we have other more common species like the mitered parakeet, Nande parakeet, red-masked, yellow chevron, yellow-headed parrots, but with far fewer observations. As we keep going down the list, we can see we have other very common pets like budgies, we have cockatiels, lovebirds, with much fewer observations. As we continue, we have other very charismatic birds like macaws. We have different parakeets. And then for the least seen, we have different rosellas, other parakeets, but these all only have one observation. But even so, there are 37 species of parrots and parakeets that have been observed in Southern California. And these are just the ones that were photographed. We have no way of knowing if there's others that just maybe haven't been photographed or identified correctly. And so 37 is still a huge number. And so it's really interesting to think about how these parrots are surviving here, how they're integrating into new flocks, things like that. And so we were really interested in the most commonly observed species, which is the red-crowned parrot. And coincidentally, the sister species, the lilac-crowned parrot, can also be found in Southern California. And so we were really interested in these specific parrots. And so for some background on them, the lilac-crowned parrot is found on the coast of Western Mexico. You can see their range is highlighted in purple. whereas the red-crowned parrot is found in eastern Mexico, highlighted in red. And so these species have been introduced into Southern California where they are thriving. And so for their native habitats, they are separated by 2 mountain ranges and a desert. The lilac-crowned parrot typically is found in tropical dry forest and coniferous forests at higher elevations, whereas the red-crowned parrot is found in lowland subdeciduous tropical forests. And so these species never come into contact in their native ranges, but through the illegal pet trade and through accidental releases and escapes, they now come into contact. And so, unfortunately, both of these species are endangered in their native ranges, but the almost silver lining is that they're thriving in Southern California. Here, as I'm sure you've all seen, there are larger flocks, both here and in San Diego, and they're found in very urbanized areas. They don't seem to mind cars or construction or people very much. A lot of them can be seen eating fruit from introduced trees, and very interestingly, they're found in mixed species flocks. And so with this, they form these roosts, typically in the fall-winter months, with over 1,000 parrots. And so this is one of my favorite events that we have at the Moore Lab. It's called Follow the Flock, where we take a group of people to the Temple City Parrot Roost as an outreach event to teach them about the parrots that are in their communities. And so I have 2 short clips to kind of give you a taste of what that feels like. So as you can see, the street was super busy. These parrots did not seem to mind. They were just interested in all gathering in one spot, this very tree-filled street, and settling in for the night. And so we should be having Follow the Flock coming up again this year. We will post it on our Eventbrite page. But if you've never been to the flock, I definitely recommend it. It's an incredible just thing to experience. And so to kind of start the research questions that we were looking into, we, number one, needed to figure out how to create a robust data set for these sister species, both here in Southern California as well as in their native ranges, so that we could compare the differences. Number two, we had to figure out how to distinguish between these 2 very similar looking sister species and how to make sure that we do it reliably using community science data. And then number 3, we wanted to understand how the environmental conditions of their Mexican native ranges compared to their shared introduced range. So to start with our first question of how to build a robust data set, we turn to community science observations. As I'm sure many of you have used iNaturalist, that's our main source for the observations of Southern California. As I mentioned, we have our FLAPP project, which automatically collects any observations from the family Cetacea on iNaturalist. And so from this, we've been able to gather data from across all of Southern California while involving people in science that's happening in their neighborhoods. We're really big on doing school events, getting K through 12 involved so that it's a welcoming experience and that everyone can be involved in the research that's happening with species found in their own backyards. And so this is what FLAPP looks like. If you are not familiar with the iNaturalist projects, we collect observations here. So already we have over 8,000 observations of 37 different species. We have over 2,000 observers or people uploading photos. If you have any photos of parrots within your area, please join our project. And I do want to emphasize that when you download iNaturalist and do end up following FLAPP, please trust FLAPP. And so what that means is when you join our group, essentially it asks you if it's okay to share the location of where your observation was found. eBird will automatically obscure observations for endangered species, which is super important. However, in order to really study them and understand which environmental conditions they're associated with, we need those geospatial coordinates. And so it's important to join FLAPP and then trust so that we have access to that. And so to participate, you would just upload your photos, as I'm sure many of you have, but an example is This is a red-crowned parrot that I saw at Oxy on campus, and so I uploaded it with the suggestions that are pretty spot on. You can see that it suggests the genus Amazona, but then some top suggestions would be red-crowned, lilac-crowned, and red-lord parrot. And so these all look pretty similar. And so it's easy to kind of choose which you think is most likely. And so for the data collection, we have the parrot observations evaluated to confirm species identification. Since we're using this data to study these species specifically, we want to make sure that it's accurate. And so iNaturalist will have 2 agreeing identifications to use as a research grade observation. So it's kind of an approved identification of that species. And then also we have the geotemporal data for each of these observations. So you can see the latitude and the longitude of where that bird was seen. And so that's important for our research. And so that brings us to the question of how you can really distinguish between these sister species since they look so similar. And so the thing that we look for are iris color, bare skin, so the orbital around the eye and the cere above the beak, the forecrown color, and then if there's scalloping on the breast feathers or not. So for a closer look, when we look at a lilac-crowned parrot, zoom in, we want to see a darker red or orange iris. We want to see a dark gray orbital, so darker kind of skin around that eye, the darker nostrils above the beak, and we want to see that maroon, that deep red maroon forecrown. For the red-crowned parrot, if we zoom in, we want to see a lighter yellow iris, that white skin around the eye, more of a cream-colored nostril color, and then that bright cherry red forecrown. And so when you look at them up close, it does seem a little bit easier to distinguish them, but when they're in a huge flock far away, it can be a little intimidating. So I think it's important to know like these key features to look for to kind of jump out at you. So I always like to think that the lilac-crowned parrot has a smoky eye. It has that dark eyeshadow around its eye, ready to hit the town. And so they do have those darker features that make it a little bit easier to distinguish. And then the red-crowned parrots do have those lighter features, and that forecrown does tend to extend further back than on the lilac-crowned parrot. And so now that we kind of have a way of identifying all of our species, we can use this data to really assess the differences between the environmental conditions in these ranges. And so to gather all of the information, we use iNaturalist for the Southern California observations, and then for the Mexican ranges, we use eBird. And so we use eBird because it has similar information. The main difference is that it doesn't require a photograph, and so that's mainly why we didn't use it for the Southern California observations. There was no way to confirm the species identification without a photograph, and so we figured iNaturalist would be best, and that way more of the community can be involved, whereas in Mexico, because the sister species don't coexist in their native ranges, species misidentification was less likely. And so with community science data, there's a lot of biases associated with it. And so we made sure to filter our data and process it to try and account for all of those. We removed any observations that were found outside of the native range, and then we followed established best practices to account for some of these geospatial biases. So for our final data set, we ended up with 517 red-crowned parrots and 372 lilac-crowned parrots in Southern California. And then for their Mexican ranges, we had 748 red-crowned parrots and 5,786 lilac-crowned parrots. To get into how we compared their environments, we downloaded geospatial environmental data. So essentially, these are all different layers that we can stack up on top of each other like a cake, and then we get a slice of that cake to see what the environmental conditions were like in that specific spot. And so for these environmental conditions, we included bioclim, which is 19 temperature and precipitation variables. Here we have things like annual precipitation, annual temperature range, seasonality, just different conditions throughout the different areas. We use normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, which is a measure of vegetation greenness. We use the standard deviation of NDVI to measure greenness seasonality. How does the change in season affect the greenness of the area? We used MODIS to assess percent tree cover. We used terrestrial quickscat as a measure of urbanization. And then we also included elevation, since the lilac-crowned parrots in Mexico do prefer higher elevations. And so it's important to really include the entire breadth of the environment. So we made sure to add buffers to sample the environmental conditions of the surrounding areas of where the parrots were found. And it's important to use the overall conditions to assess the differences so that we capture the full story and not just little pieces of it. To show you what these background points look like, we have the presences colored in blue, purple, and red to show the observations where the parrots were found. And then the background data is the area surrounding the presence point. So you can see there's a buffer surrounding all of these points. To extract the environmental data, it's pulled from each layer at each of the locations the parrots were observed. So as you can see, there's this stack of environmental layers here. We could say this is annual precipitation, elevation, urbanization, tree cover, greenness, and then we take the point where the parrot was found and we pull all of the conditions at that point, as well as the surrounding area. And so we use this to compare the conditions both in Mexico and in Southern California. And so to compare the Amazona niches, we used 3 different analyses. The first is a principal component analysis, which essentially assesses the variation within our data. Points that are grouped closer together are more similar, and so the PCs, or the different axes on our graph, explain the most variation. So in this example, PC1, 40% of the differences between all of our observations are explained by temperature, greenness, precipitation, and tree cover, whereas only 15% of the differences between our data on PC2 is explained by precipitation. And so essentially what we're trying to see is how similar are these environmental niches, and that's based on how close together these different circles are. We also use univariate box plots between both of the species at both regions. Here, we're looking at specific environmental conditions for each of the species, and we can see the range that they cover. The colored portions of the boxes include the main regions that they occupy, and then the gray circles represent the less commonly observed environmental conditions that they're found in. And then finally, we use reciprocal species distribution models. The way that these models work is they show predictions of suitable habitat, with warmer colors representing high suitability and cooler colors representing low suitability. And so this is a way of predicting how the conditions in Mexico would be in Southern California. How comparable are they? How similar are they? And so to begin with our first principal component analysis, we have the lilac-crowned observations in this lilac purple, and you can see they're from Western Mexico. We have the red-crowned parrot observations from Eastern Mexico. And you can see that although the circles are basically touching, they are not overlapping. And so that tells us that these environmental niches are different. They're similar, but they're different. And so that makes sense. Eastern and Western Mexico are pretty different. And so when we add in Southern California, or our introduced population, here we can see that the circles are overlapping now, which we expect since they're found in the same area. And so we know that the conditions experienced here are the same. And so again, on PC1, we have temperature, greenness, precipitation, and tree cover. We can see that Southern California is very different from the conditions experienced in Mexico. And this is only where the parrots are seen specifically. This is where they were observed, and we pulled the environmental conditions from those points. When we add in the surrounding environmental conditions shown by these darker circles, so this darker purple is the environmental, or E-space, of the lilac-crowned parrots in Western Mexico. You can see it encompasses the observations of the lilac-crowned parrots completely. Then we have the red-crowned parrot observations with the environmental space surrounding it in that darker burgundy color. And then in this dashed green line, we have the Southern California introduced environmental space. And so now this is where we start to see the overlap. You can see that there are some sections of the Southern California region that does overlap with the environmental conditions found in both areas of Mexico. So it's not completely unreasonable that these parrots have been able to establish here. Southern California isn't exactly like where they were in Mexico, but it is similar enough that they've been able to establish these huge populations. And so if we want to look a little bit closer at the top variables that are kind of explaining the variation seen within our data, we can see that annual mean temperature and vegetation greenness were some of the top drivers. And so you can see that in the introduced range, they are almost completely out of the ranges that the native populations are found in. So once again, the way that we read these plots is we have the native and introduced red and lilac-crowned parrot conditions, and then on the x-axis, we have the environmental predictor. And so the first box plot is showing an annual mean temperature, and we can see that there's more of a spread for the lilac-crowned parrots and the temperature ranges that they experience in Mexico, with the introduced populations not overlapping very much with the native population temperature. When we look at vegetation greenness, it's a similar story. The lilac-crowned parrots do experience that wider range in their native range, as well as the red-crowned expanding out a little bit more, but similarly, not as much in Southern California. We can see that the vegetation greenness is lower here. When we look at precipitation seasonality and elevation, we can see that lilac-crowned parrots do typically experience higher precipitation seasonality in Mexico and are typically found in higher elevations as well, whereas in Southern California, that's not the case. And so this really emphasizes that although these conditions are not identical, they still kind of, they don't make that much of a difference to these parrots. They've been able to kind of adapt and fit into Southern California. When we look at reciprocal species distribution models, the way that these models work is essentially we create a map of suitable habitat within Mexico. So here you can see for the red-crowned parrot, the red areas represent the areas where they are found. So that is a considered suitable habitat. And then as the buffer expands outward, we can see that the habitat gets less suitable since they're not found in these areas, and they could very well expand out if they had wanted to. And so what we do is we take the suitable and unsuitable habitat for Mexico and we project that to Southern California. Essentially, we're saying what conditions in Southern California match the conditions of Mexico. And so once again, the warmer colors represent high suitability and the cooler colors represent lower suitability. Here we have very few spots of low suitable habitat. And so although it's low, they are found in the key areas where these parrots have established. So you can see there's some color in Los Angeles and in the San Diego areas. And so although it is showing some color, I do want to emphasize that this is very low suitable habitat and it wouldn't be very likely for the parrots to be found here. However, because we did the principal component analysis, we were able to see that the surrounding environmental conditions of Mexico do kind of allow the parrots to survive here in Southern California. They're similar enough. When we look at the lilac-crowned parrot, once again, we have the suitable habitat of Western Mexico for this species projected to Southern California. And surprisingly, we see even less suitable habitat. We still see that small pocket in Los Angeles, but again, very low suitability. So we wouldn't typically expect the parrots to be found here. And so that brings us to the question of what has really made them successful in Southern California. And so there's a few things that come to mind, like food availability. As I mentioned, there's a lot of introduced fruit trees and different food sources that the native populations of birds aren't taking advantage of or aren't used to eating. And so parrots have had a buffet. They have been able to enjoy all of the food that we love as well, like loquats and other introduced plants. Another thing is propagule pressure. So this is when a species gets introduced many, many times over a wide time scale. And so parrots are getting released presumably pretty regularly. They escape or, they get released. And so these numerous introductions allow the populations to kind of get injected with a few like spikes in parrots. So that definitely helps. Another theory would be ecological release, which essentially is they have been brought to this place where they don't have the same pressures that they had in their native ranges. There could be less competition, there could be more resources, there could be more nesting areas. And then that also brings us to human-made and natural cavity nests. So they have been able to find nests without any issues, and so that allows them to also be successful in Southern California. And so the main conclusions that we have for this project so far is that community science is a key tool for understanding these parrots. We would have never been able to do this project without iNaturalist and being able to confirm species identifications that the public has already started. And then we were also able to really understand that they have very different environmental niches in Mexico, but they have been able to adapt to survive and thrive in Southern California. And so now there is a new opportunity for hybridization, which is a very hot topic. I feel like whenever we get asked about the Parrot project, a question that always comes up is there going to be a new species? And so the start of a new species takes a very long time, so there's no way of knowing, but they are hybridizing. And so the way that you can distinguish hybrids from the parent species is they have mixed features. And so for this example of a hybrid, they have a lighter orange or yellow iris. You can see it's not as dark as a lilac-crowned, but it's also more orange than you would see in a red-crowned parrot. You can see they have that white orbital, that dark gray cere, and then they have a cherry red forecrown. And so all of these mixed features lead us to believe that it is a hybrid. And so we did recently publish all of our findings with the environmental comparisons in diversity and distributions. If you're interested in kind of getting a more in-depth explanation of everything and other parts of the project that we've been working on, feel free to check out this paper. Something really incredible about this paper is that we have, I believe it was 10 undergraduate students that were included because they were key in getting this paper done. I mean, we had students looking through parrot photos, we had students helping with the data analysis, and so it was a very incredible project to be a part of. For future directions, we really want to dig into the hybridization aspect and really look into their rates and dynamics. How often are we seeing these interspecies pairs in iNaturalist observations? We want to really understand if there are any reproductive barriers between the two species. Is there anything stopping them from hybridizing? We also want to know what has allowed the red-crowned parrots in particular to establish in other areas of the United States. Like, for example, there's populations in Texas, Florida, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. And so it would be interesting to see how these different populations and environmental conditions compare to the Mexican range. And I know there's some debate about whether the Texas population is an extension of the native Mexican range. And so it would be interesting to dig into that a little bit more. And then it would be also very interesting to see if other non-native parrots are taking advantage of the same environmental conditions and population resources, and if there's any competition between these species. I assume that since they all have similar diets and have different native regions, it would be interesting to see how they're all interacting with one another. And then finally, we are actually working on this now, is comparing the genetics of older museum specimen with present day samples to understand how these parrots have evolved over time and how Southern California has changed them genetically. So although I don't have updates on that yet, we are working on it, and I hope to present that data at the American Ornithological Society conference coming up in October, which is very soon. But for now, that's where I'm going to leave it. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. There are some QR codes on the screen where you can join our iNaturalist project, check out upcoming More Lab events, and even shop our merch. But thank you for listening.
Excellent. That was marvelous. If you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A tab down the bottom of your screen. That kind of help us keep track of everything. Brenda, do you want me to read the questions to you or?
Sure.
Okay. First one is from Lily,
Mhm.
and she asks, have the parrots competed with native species at all?
That's a really good question. So as far as we know, no. I know some people have mentioned that the Nandays do compete with I believe it was the acorn woodpeckers, for cavity nests. I haven't seen it myself, but I think it's a pretty prominent thing that's happening. But besides that, I don't think so. I feel like they have different diets and potentially just the cavity nests are the only thing that could cause some tension between the native species and the parrots.
Have you observed, or anyone in iNaturalist observed, parrots or parakeets going into scrub habitat or moving up the mountains? I haven't, but I don't know if any.
That's a really good question. So someone actually brought this up at a different talk saying that there could be some mountain observations on eBird. And so I said that would be really interesting, but there's no way of
Yeah,
confirming it, unfortunately. And so it's definitely something that we're trying to like account for. But as far as I've seen on iNaturalist,
you haven't. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it always scares me if I see a parrot moving up towards the scrub and all that. Interesting. We have some more questions. An attendee asks, do parrots have a like home do parrots have a like home range, give or take potential multiple habitat types? They fly around at least for some periods of the year.
Yeah, so the parrots are resident species. They're not going to migrate. I know some people do
Right.
believe that they flew themselves here from Mexico, but that's not the case. As far as we know, the parrots aren't traveling very far. They do fly around. They mainly do that looking for food, and then when it's breeding season, looking for nesting cavities. And so they do typically stay in their own little ranges and pockets. And so, for example, there's roosts in Temple City, there's smaller ones in Pasadena. I've heard of some in Santa Ana, the San Diego roost. And so I don't believe there's any mixing between these larger
Oh.
gaps in between these populations.
And the Temple City roost, as you probably know, is really devastated. What was it, about 10 years ago, by some horrendous winds we had? And the winds literally knocked the parrots out of the roost in Temple City, and many were roosting up in Pasadena and other places we could not find. But now they seem to be returning to Temple City.
Yeah, they've definitely come back in large numbers.
Yeah. Benjamin asks, based on the preliminary genetic data that you have,
Mhm.
do you have a general idea of the genetic diversity of the population in Southern California here? And are they descended from a relatively few number of birds, or was a larger number, or is there a larger number of individuals?
That's a really great question. So, although there's no way of telling if they descended from specific birds, we do have some native Mexican specimen that serve kind of as our anchors that are
Mm,
pure red crown, pure lilac crown. And so we've
mm,
found preliminarily that most of the parrots are not really hybridizing. There's a few hybrids that we've seen coming in from the Southern California populations, but not a ton, which is very interesting, which is why we also want to investigate if there's any reproductive isolating barriers. But for the specimen that we do have that have those mixed features, it looks as though they might be back crosses, which essentially is we have a red-crowned and a lilac-crowned parrot had a hybrid baby, and then that baby ended up mating with one of the parent species and not another hybrid. And so we're really trying to dig into that and try to understand why that is.
interesting. Fascinating. Alex asks, in their home ranges, were they the only parrots around and never really mixed with other species?
That's a good
So
question.
mhm.
I think it depends on the parrot that you're talking about. As far as I know, for these two, they were the
Mhm.
only ones in those areas.
Oh, so there weren't other parrots or parakeets in their
Not that I
areas?
know of, but I would have to double check that.
Okay, okay, interesting. Yeah, parrots have been part of the birding landscape for decades and decades, obviously, here in Southern California. And it's interesting to see how attitudes of birders have changed over the decades.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
mhm, uh, as
Well,
not only towards parrots, but other non-native
mhm.
species and all that. And for you know be it at for whichever side of the argument you're on, I'm glad to see that uh, they're keeping that you're helping us understand how the parrots affect us here in Southern California. Celia asks, do you have maps of where different parrot species are found in our area here in Southern California?
Not yet, but I feel like that could be a very promising undergraduate project. I know we have some students coming in this semester that are really excited about our parrot project, and so I think it would be wonderful if we could expand to studying other species as well.
And also, you can get that information off of eBird.
Yes.
So, Celia, you might want to explore eBird a bit more for that information.
So,
That
yeah, I have a question about the stability of the populations here. As you
Mhm.
know, yellow-headed parrots used to be much more common and was what I've heard in the past were a dominant species here in Southern California, and they've declined pretty dramatically. There's still some around, but they're not nearly the dominant species. What's happening with, these two species that you're studying? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Or can you tell?
Well, very interestingly, the yellow-headed parrot was actually the first parrot in Southern California, and so it is kind of sad to see that they're not as common as they once were. As far as I know, these parrots, their populations have pretty much stabilized. I don't believe that they're increasing in these crazy numbers anymore. And I think that's due to, the resources that are available to them. They can't overexploit them, or else then the population would decline again. And so I think that the populations are pretty stable.
interesting, interesting.
Are they
And
are
it's
they subject to the pet trade here? And I've heard or rumors that people have seen people, capturing the parrots and, maybe trying to remake them pets again. What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, so I think last month I saw a post in Monrovia where someone in Arcadia was putting up nets trying to capture these birds again. And I know that there was a story that went pretty popular, or that went pretty viral in Temple City, where someone was putting up nets at the roost site. And so, interestingly, at our Follow the Flock event, one of the people that lives in the apartment complex came up to us and they told us, like, oh, we took some of the nets down, like we hate that they're trying to take them, it's not right. And so the people are mad about it. I'm mad about it. These birds are wild. We don't want to capture them and sell them as pets. They wouldn't make very good pets. They aren't domesticated. They're wild parrots. And so it's very frustrating to see that people are still trying to poach them, even as adults. And so the only thing I can say to that is do not approach anyone that is setting up a net or anything like that. Just call the authorities, make sure that you stay safe primarily and that it will
absolutely.
resolve
And
itself.
Pasadena Humane Society covers most of our areas here in Pasadena, Monrovia, Temple City, all of that. So Pasadena Humane should be something on your speed dial. An anonymous person asks, why haven't these two parrots taken over cities in Mexico? They've taken over, obviously, in Temple City.
That's a good question. So in Mexico, they don't have to do that. I mean, their habitats are declining with deforestation and poaching, and their numbers are declining, but I don't think it would be their first instinct to go into a city. These parrots in Southern California were brought here, and so they're kind of making the best out of that situation. And so it wouldn't really make sense for those parrots to just instinctively know, like, oh, there's resources here. And I also feel like Mexico City might not have as many introduced fruit trees and other more kind of suburban areas that have those resources that we have in Southern California. If you go into Mexico City itself, it's very, very urbanized and not similar to Temple City, for example. But that's a good question. I feel like they just don't realize that, like, maybe they could find a little patch of refugia there.
Yeah, they might be able to. Down in Temple City, though, the trees planted there are very mature, large, obviously wonderful for species to breed in and all that.
Mhm.
Another attendee asks, is there anything other than resource limitations that can keep a check on parrot population? I have seen falcons chasing parakeets, but haven't seen anything that can take down a parrot here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Um, yeah, I don't think that they have very like many predators, which is part of the release that they experienced here. And so I don't really foresee anything limiting them besides the resources and maybe even limitations to nesting cavities. I don't think that there's anything that's really declining their populations. I mean, some of the biggest things is, well, at least the reason that they get sent to SoCal Parrot, which is a parrot rescue, is they're injured. And so maybe cars or people with nets, they could hurt the population. But besides that, there isn't anything dramatically affecting their numbers.
Okay.
Are they susceptible to bird flu?
Not that I know of, but I don't think there's very much research on that yet.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And you haven't heard about sick parrots anywhere, I take it, as we had sick crows and things like that.
No,
In the
the main thing is just injuries.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. I think we're running out of questions. Brenda, thank you very much for a wonderful webinar. It really got our juices flowing. In the past, we have had an iNaturalist field trip, and perhaps it's time for another one and get going on on FLAPP and help people out and help you guys out at the Moore Labs. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And the last thing I want to say is if you want to kind of do your part for the parrots is try to keep the nesting sites private. Don't really publicly share them since there are poachers that we have seen are actively trying to catch these birds. And so that's a small thing that we can do to help protect them.
And iNaturalist has the ability to keep it um,
Obscured and
confidential.
private. Mm-hmm.
And eBird also has that ability also. So please be aware of that no matter which way you go.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you again. Please, everyone, please join us next week for another wonderful webinar by Diego Blanco. We're looking forward to that. And again, thank you very much, Brenda, for a wonderful program tonight.
Thank you, and we'd really like to have you come back and tell us about the genetic results you're going to be presenting at AOS.
Absolutely.
I would love that. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Well,
you,
thank
Brenda.
you.
It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Good night, everyone. I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.